They were the two greatest adventures of the 1960s, in a decade that had plenty of adventures and misadventures. They conveniently start these two adventures in 1960, give or take, and they're done by 1970. So they go all the way through the decade. It's like two strands of DNA continuously intertwined from beginning to end. And there are also two sides of the coin, two sides of the generational divide. The Race to the Moon is a product of the over 30 generation, and the Beatles were a product of the under 30 generation. Now I like this picture because Richard Avedon, who was one of the more famous photographers in that decade, had the same idea I did. He said, I'm going to take two of the biggest topics of the day and I'm going to put them together. And so with that, we put Paul McCartney in a spacesuit. It's hard to imagine today, but everybody in this picture in the 1960s was a household name. So the guys above were the Mercury 7 astronauts, the first American astronauts, and of course, you recognize the four guys below. It's hard to imagine today also how totally these two topics, the Race to the Moon and the Beatles, totally dominated the news. If you read magazines, you would have found that throughout the decade, there was always something about the Beatles or the Race to the Moon. There's really not been any topic since then that so dominates a decade from beginning to end. So you had the first man in space, who was not American, he was Russian, Yuri Gagarin. And of course, you had space magazines, which don't exist anymore, really. Going to the moon was part science and part science fiction. These were the first 7 astronauts, once again. The man who built the rockets that would take us to the moon. The first 3 astronauts. The first American in space, Alan Shepard. The first American to orbit the Earth, John Glenn. And it goes on and on and on, even in France. More space, more space, more space, every week. And then, of course, finally, man on the moon. And, of course, the Beatles were equally everywhere. 1964, Newsweek, when the Beatles arrived. Finally, it's very hard to imagine that all of those songs that you know or are going to learn about pertaining to the Beatles were all recorded in a 7-year period. I was 10 years old when the Beatles arrived in America. And by the time I was 17, it was all over. That's how quick it was. So these are the songs, some of their standout songs from 1963 and 1964. I'm sure you recognize a few of these songs. And then this was the next year. Not only the songs, but the movies. They did A Hard Day's Night in '64, and then the next year they were in the movie Help. Not to mention all the songs that went along with those movies. '66 wasn't bad. I'm guessing you recognize a couple of songs here. And this is just the tip of the iceberg, of course. Now this would be an entire career for a band. That 1 year, if you could be a band today and have that kind of success over your entire career, you would be a very, very successful act. And yet, this was just 1 year in the year of the Beatles. Not too bad over here. And their swan song in 1969, not a bad way to end your career as a band. Now, the good news is, if you know the Beatles songs, then you will find them everywhere in magazines and newspapers. And it's a little bit of a head game, because if you don't know the Beatles songs, you won't even realize that you are looking at a Beatles song when you look at a magazine. But if you know, then you go, oh, I know what this author was thinking of. So, and these are all recent examples. Okay? So these are not examples from the 60s and the 70s. These are the examples from the last few years. You can go out and buy, today, some Strawberry Field cereal. Lonely Hearts Club. Let It Be. Letter B, Sesame Street. Letter B, letter B. Okay. Get Back is a popular song. Get Back. Or in music, Get Bop. A lot of Get Bop. Get Bop. Get Bop. Here Comes the Sun. Sun cream, solar panels, sun protection, sun everything. Solar eclipses. Here comes the sun. Here comes the sun. Okay, they sang this last night. How many people saw the Grammy tribute last night? Okay. Did you like it? I thought it was pretty good. Anyway, a little help from my friends. Vanity Fair, The Economist, Sirius Magazine, American Scientist, another Sirius Magazine. All You Need Is Love. Okay, Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds, Planet in the Sky with Diamonds, Carrie in the Sky with Diamonds, Apple in the Sky. Planets in the Sky with Diamonds. Somebody wrote a book. Back in the USSR. How many people know that song? Okay. All right. Back in the USSR. Now this is just in last December. Okay? So this is not old. December of 2013. Back in the USSR. All together now. So sometimes in order not to pay the royalties or get in trouble, see they put a period after each word. All together now. Ooh, very clever. All together now. Baby, you can drive my car. Baby, you can hack my car. Can't buy me love. Can't buy me love. Here, there, and everywhere. Another biggie. This is also a recent one. January 2013, just a year ago. How many people know this song? And how many people in America do you think realize that this was a Beatles song on the cover of Time magazine? Sometimes it's not the title of the song, it's the first line of the song. So you say you want a revolution from the song Revolution. And then the overall winner, the one that I've seen come up the most, is A Day in the Life, or the first line of A Day in the Life. Anybody know what the first line is? I read the news today.
Oh boy.
I read the news today. Oh boy. So now what I'd like to do is I want to go through some stories. These are all stories that are in the book, and I just picked some of the juiciest ones. And I'll alternate a little bit between a Beatles story and a space story. And you can interrupt me at any point, by the way, if you have a question. You don't have to save it till the end. I don't mind being interrupted. So we'll skip Gus Grissom's flight, and we're going to go right to this. So, as big a song as I Want to Hold Your Hand is, and has been since its release 50 years ago, the fact of the matter is, Capitol Records in America had no interest in the Beatles at the beginning. When the Beatles released their first hit in England, which was Please Please Me, Alan Livingston in America, who ran Capitol Records, the sister company for the Beatles recording company in England, had no interest. When they released their second hit, which was From Me to You, Alan Livingston, Capitol Records, no interest. when they had their third hit, a monster hit throughout Europe that set off Beatlemania, which was She Loves You, Alan Livingston and Capitol Records had no interest whatsoever. When I Want to Hold Your Hand came out, Alan Livingston had no interest whatsoever. However, or I should say as an explanation, Capitol Records and Alan Livingston had dipped their toes into rock and roll music in the 50s, and they had picked the wrong acts, and they hadn't done well. So they were not inclined to go with rock and roll. And they had just signed another band that started with BEA. What would that be? The Beach Boys, and they were from California, right there with Capitol Records. So they didn't need another rock and roll band, especially since Alan Livingston hated the way the Beatles looked, their ridiculous hair. He hated their name. He hated their sound. He thought, you know, who jumps an octave when you sing, I want to hold your hand? But that was like absurd. But the records were selling very, very, very well in England. And of course, the Beatles were coming to America to play on the Ed Sullivan Show. So Alan Livingston had no choice, and he finally relented to release Beatle records in America. And of course, the rest is history. So, because the Beatles had long hair, at least by the standards of the day, all the guys wanted to wear their hair a little longer. So, how many barbershops do you think closed by the end of the decade? What would be a guess? 5%, 7%, 14.5%? Throw me some numbers here. 20%? 20%? Any other numbers? 40%. So, I didn't make this up. Somebody actually gave me a book on the history of barbershops in America, and there was a chapter devoted to the awful Beatles. So, you can discuss the music of the Beatles all day long, because the music was wonderful and there was a whole lot to discuss, but the Beatles had a tremendous impact on society, other than the music. I mean, for the last 50 years, any guy who likes to wear his hair a little on the long side owes a debt to the Beatles. Because now, a guy can wear his hair any length he wants, and nobody's going to say anything. Guys wanted to look like this. They wanted to look like that. They wanted to look like this, or like that. Now, when you consider again how popular the Beatles became and how their popularity has endured, you would think the critics would have been completely on board right from the start. Well, you couldn't be more wrong. Because remember, the critics were over the age of 30. And if you were over the age of 30, the only thing you noticed was that the Beatles looked ridiculous with their long hair, and they were loud, and they were awful. So, to wit, the home of rock and roll. It wasn't the home of rock and roll back then. So what changed? Well, in the summer of '64, the Beatles released their first movie, A Hard Day's Night. And it was actually a tremendous success. Not a success only in terms of sales, because that the Beatles were guaranteed. But the over 30 generation, the critics, actually recognized it as being a really, really good movie. And then suddenly, you started to see these kind of reviews. And there it was. So now, any questions about that? I want to skip to a space. So, Ed White was the first American to walk in space.